Very good morning to everyone. As part of continuous improvement and understanding software designing technique using C# programming, we are moving to the next level now. Till now, what we have done is like we developed a building application which simply add records to a data table, and then we are able to modify it. Finally, we are also able to print that bill, right? To that level, we have implemented, but we want to move to the next level now. When you create an invoice or bill, it is not like you just generate a bill and then you will done with it. So you need a records. Otherwise, the detail of that bill to be stored somewhere for a later point of time in order to refer or reprint or modify, we need the bill in place. Right, it should be stored somewhere. How can we do that? Where to store it? When it is a computer, you will store that in a permanent memory, which is nothing but the hard disk. When we store something in hard disk, we cannot store it like directly. We cannot go and store them in the memory sectors of hard disk. We have to follow a file system, because between us and between the C# and hardware, that is hard disk hardware, there is an operating system. We cannot directly go and touch the hardware using a programming language without getting permission from the OS. That we can achieve it via file system. So every operating system has its own file system. Linux has its own file system. Unix has its own file system. Similarly, Windows as well has its own file system. So we have to follow a file system method to store the records in the hard disk of the computer. Okay, what are the options available? There are different options available. Today we have RDBMS, Relational Database Management System, and then somehow older one like Access Database, and then SQLite database, MySQL database. Lot of database management systems are available in the market. They are already pre-developed. This is one way of storing the records in a file and then retrieving them back. But for a sake of simplicity, and then to understand how this database managing system works, so we can use a simple file system, like you can store the data in a text file and then retrieve it. So, but modern applications, no, we have something file system, some sort of file system that is called as XML. This can be used to store the dynamic data in a hard disk, and we can use that XML files as a database. So available options are many, but among them, very basic and simple one are text files and then XMLs. I choose XML over text file because they have a ready-made C# functions to access them, and it is very easy to fetch the record from the XML than the text file. It doesn't mean that the text files are not good and we cannot use them as a database. It is possible. That's how the database management systems started. So it started with a text file. Then they move to the different level. Finally, we have relational database management system today. Right. So in my view, as far as our application is concerned, as we are learning by doing a project, as we are in a stage of storing a data in a database, I choose XML files as a database. We are going to proceed with that one. Then one another, before doing this, storing the data in a file or a database, we need some more things that is not available in our current implementation, which is like a unique ID for every invoice. Because when you store certain things in a database, you have to have a unique ID for your records. So one bill, one invoice is one record. So this each bill will have a unique number. So that is very common when you use any bill system. There will be a unique serial number or invoice number like that will be used in order to track that invoice, right? No, so that is not available in our case, which is not present in our application as of now. It's simply we feed the data and then we just take the printout of that one, right, after calculating the total. That's how it is now. So but we want to improve it to the next level, which that we want to store the data to a file which need a unique ID for tracking purpose, so that we are going to implement them. So in order to implement them, we need a label because it is a unique one. I think there is okay. So invoice number, right? So invoice number is the one that we are not going to modify it, and it is auto generated. So we are going to auto generate that one because as it is unique, how to generate a unique number for each invoice. The best way to, one of the best way to generate a unique number is using the timestamp of the PC, because the timestamp is the one which is unique. Every time, every seconds, we get a new timestamp, right? No, so that can be used to generate an invoice number, right? Also, we don't have a provision to encode our application doesn't display the current date, because when you make a bill or something like that, you should have a track of dates. So when it was raised and those details, right? Now, so only then it is a complete invoice. So date and invoice numbers are very much important. That is not available in our previous implementation that we are going to include. In order to include that, you can simply bring a label from the toolbox, one label for invoice number, a label that means to display that like it is an invoice number, and then to store or display the invoice number, we need another label. So you can ask me a question, why don't we use a text box instead of label? Yes, we can go for a text box. The text box are something like when you want to input something, you can go for text box. But when it comes to invoice number, it is just like invoice number is a auto-generated number which is going to be displayed. There is no, the user doesn't have any role to modify it, that one right now. So that's why I put a label for to display the invoice number as well instead of a text box. Then for date as well, so we don't need a text box, input text box. We are not going to feed date. For that also, I developed a label, like I call that label as date label, and then I have it. Now, these two labels, that invoice number label as well as the date label, should be populated. When we up the application, they should have the date should display the current date, and invoice number should display a unique number. In order to display the date, the running date or running time stamp, what I did is that is the C# has a object called timer. Using that, you can create a delay. That is, you can create a periodic event. So what I did, I just brought that object from the toolbox. You can search it like using like timer. You can bring it here. Right, we have a timer. I brought that timer. Once you brought the timer, you have option to configure. I configure that into 1000 millisecond, which is nothing but 1 second, and then I can even create a event for that. When 1 second timer is by default, I enable the timer. We have option to enable. When I run the application, immediately the timer will start every 1 second. Once the 1 second is expired, it will come and execute this event handler. Otherwise, this routine, what is this routine? The routine is like it populates the date label. That date label.txt is equal to date time.now.toString. So the date time is an what is a predefined object, so which contain the current date and time, otherwise a timestamp. Then I take the current time using a now, that is now option. Then I convert that into string, because the time is in the in a different data type. In order to display that in a label, I have to convert into a string. When I convert that into string, I am following a format identifier because in India, we follow like date, month, year, date format. In US, it is different, like month, date, year, or something like that. No. So in order to shoot Indian subcontinent, I use this format identifier TDMMYY, and then I also include hours, minute, and second in my application in order to display the date. That is what that I am doing as part of the timer object in order to display the current time in a label in my application. That is going to happen, right? So that is first step that I did. After doing it, I think I made so after displaying the date, I have to find out a unique invoice number for every invoice, right? For that, I use a different things, which is nothing but in constructor of that billing form. So this is like constructor, no. That means very first time when I run the application, this one will be executed by default. So here I populate the invoice number label with the date time. That means I convert the year to string and then month to string, and then I concat them. Day to string, and then hours to string, minutes to string, and seconds to string, so that I will get a unique number every time when I run the application. That means I will get a unique invoice number, right? That is the aim. So we address the two things, like we generated an invoice number, which is unique, and then we also display the current date time in our application. These are the two steps that we did. So let me check whether they are working. For that, I simply run my application. When I run it, right, here I have a date, here I have a unique invoice number. Right. So after doing it, I can do whatever that I used to do. Like I will feed item number, rate, quantity, and amount, all those things. I will create a list of item that I am going to that I am going to bill. Also, I will in parallel, I will calculate the total amount. If I want to print, I can print it. Now we have a special button, a new button called save. Using this button, we are going to save that invoice into a file. Why we are storing it in a file? The reason behind that is we want to store the data in a permanent memory. The permanent memory of the laptop is hard disk. In order to access the hard disk, in between us and the hard disk, we have a OS. So we cannot directly touch the hardware without assistant of OS. That's why we are using a file system. The file system is the way to access your hardware. So using hard disk, like, so when I store it in a file, indirectly I'm storing that in the hard disk. Right now, it is in that way. So what I have done in that, in order to store that, I am using XML file system right now. I told right. For that, what I have to do, in order to include the XML related functions, those are used to store the records in a hard disk. We have a library called system.xml. You can include that simply using system.xml. Once you have done it, then we are going to write the routine under the save button. So let me uncomment that. This is the routine that we have. In this routine, I have written it before, but just I will give an explanation to you, or as well as we can even type the comments. So when I hit the save button, we are creating a XML writer setting. Usually it will help us to set the indent and other stuff. So this slide XML file setting. Right. After that, I say like you just include indent. Like when we have a tags, XML tag, you follow the indent in the file. So I set that setting dot indent to true, so that that will happen. Set indent in XML file. So after doing it, I am checking whether I have any records in my data table, which means I have any bill, that means a record in my bill, so that I can store that bill. So if that count value is greater than 0, check. Check. There is items in the bill. If there is no item, there won't be any bill. It will not be stored. So if it is so, then they will come and they are creating XML writer is a class or something like that, which create the object of writer. That writer, XML writer dot create a file sales.xml. So by following the setting is like it used to have the indent for the XML tags. That's all. This create function create an XML file under the current directory because I didn't specify any path, so that it will by default it may create the file under the debug directory. Otherwise, the current directory in which we have a exe file. Right now, later we will work on this path and other stuff. So it create a empty XML file. After doing it, we are starting that right start document, like we are creating the document. So in that, I also have a comments like this file is generated by the program. After doing it, I have a tag. Initially, I start a tag called sales, which means that this is a bill. This is related to sales. So for that, I started a tag under sales tag. I have another tag called invoice. Under invoice tag, I have another tag called invoice number. In that invoice number, I simply populate that tag with the data that I have in the invoice number label. That means unique invoice number will be populated in the tag. Then we also populate the date from the date label. After that, I start a new tag called items. Under this items tag, I have because items will be more than one right now. Sometimes it is one, most of the time it is more than one. So that's why I created a tag called items. Under that one, I check whether the data table is having more than one item. If so, I run a loop using a rider. So every time, every items that I have, every records that I have in my data table. Now, for that, I create a record in the XML file, like by starting an element call, by starting a tag called item. Under that item, I have a name of the item, and then the rate of the item, the quantity of the item, and amount. That means multiplication of rate and quantity. I populate them here. So after doing it, I end this item tag, so that every time, every record that I have in a data table will have a record of it. That is one records for each line item that I have in the data table. After that, that is, I terminate the collections using the slash item. After that, I also terminate the invoice tag that I started here right now. Finally, I end the sales tag as well. Then I flush the writer and then I close the writer, so that the data that I have in my bill will be stored in an XML file as for permanent storage. Later I can retrieve it. But as of now, what we have learned is how to store a data from our application to a database, a simple basic XML database that we have done now, right? Let me check whether that is working. So for that, we have application here. Let me stop the application one time because we recently enabled this code. So I just save the code and stop application and then run the application again. Right. So I have a unique invoice number and unique date. So then I proceed to feed the item name. Like my item name is rice. It is 80 rupees per kg. I want to buy a 5 kg of that. And then I add that as a record. And then I need oil. Then it is 125 rupees. I get a 6 liters of oil. Then I have then I have a soap. It is of 65 rupees. I want some 4 soaps. That's it. I have 1,410 is my total invoice right now. This is invoice number, this is invoice detail, this is the date. If I want to print, I can print it. For that, we have a provision right now. So when we hit that one, we can get a bill. Right. So that we have. Along with that, now I want to store this invoice in that database so that I can retrieve it later point of time. For that, I hit this save button. Upon hitting the save button, automatically it will be stored. Let us check whether what is stored in the file. For that, we have to navigate to the debug directory. So probably like Shop programming. Inside that, we have Y building software. Under that bin, then debug. Under the debug, we have sales.xml right now. So let me open that with a notepad++. Right. Here is my XML file. In that I have a sales. Under sales, I have invoice. Right. Under invoice, we have invoice number and then the date. And after that, we have items. Under items, we have different items like rice, its rate, quantity, amount, like that. And then oil, its rate, quantity, amount. Similar way, soup, rate, and its quantity and amount. Like that, it is possible to store the records that you have in your application in a database. The very simplest way is, in my view, using XML, so that it is very easy to navigate across the tags to retrieve the data. So we are using XML as a database here. Okay, team. Today we learned how to store the data in a file. We will slowly learn how to retrieve the data, how to manipulate the data in the file, and other stuff. With this, I end today's session. Thank you. Thank you for watching.